I was never the favorite. Not even close. While my brother and sister were bathed in love, I was just a shadow in the corner, unnoticed, unwanted. My mother, Helena, never raised a hand against me. She was too refined for open cruelty. Her methods were quieter but far sharper, cold indifference, long, assessing glances that made it clear I was a mistake she had never managed to correct. My older brother, Victor, was her pride. He was handsome, charming, with that effortless boldness that made people admire him. Victor could break a vase and blame the cat, and everyone would believe him. He could forget a friend's birthday, but with one charming apology he would be forgiven. The world loved Victor because he never once considered the possibility that it wouldn't. My sister Elise was Victor's opposite, warm, gentle, graceful. She spoke in a way that made her words feel like music, soothing and caressing. When she walked into a room, people were drawn to her like she was the sun. Her soft voice, her manners, everything about her was right, acceptable, worthy. And me? I was Lena. Quiet. Awkward. The one who reminded our mother of a man she despised. My father left when I was 5. I barely remember him, only a warm voice, hands lifting me into the air, and the vague feeling that, with him, I wasn't out of place. He was a dreamer, a man who wanted more but never achieved anything. When he left, my mother turned to stone. She erased him from memory, but she couldn't erase me, the child who looked too much like him. I remember the first time I truly understood that love in our family was not distributed equally. It was Christmas. Victor got a bicycle, Elise a gold locket, and I a book. Small, worn with yellowed pages. Books make people smarter, Helena said when I just stared at the gift in silence. But it wasn't about the book. It was about how it was given, without a smile, without joy, just because it was expected. I tried to earn her love. I took on more chores, helped Elise with her homework, stayed silent when Victor teased me, pretending I didn't exist. Sometimes I thought I was close, that just a little more effort would make her notice me, see me not as a mistake but as a daughter. But that never happened. One memory stands out the most. I was 10. Snow was falling outside, the world cold and silent, but inside, the fireplace glowed, filling the room with warmth. Victor and Elise sat on the floor unwrapping gifts. Elena stood nearby, her eyes shining with pride. I waited. I perched on the edge of a chair watching them, waiting for her to turn to me. She did. For just a second. But her gaze wasn't warm. It was indifferent. She looked right through me as if I didn't exist. Then she turned away. That night, for the first time, I understood there was no point in waiting. Love was either given or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, there was nothing I could do to change it. I told myself I didn't care. But I did. Helena always watched. She never had to do anything herself, she simply allowed it to happen. Victor would push past me in the hallway, knocking the books from my hands. Elise would take my favorite sweater and claim she didn't know it was mine. At the dinner table, they would speak over me, dismiss me with a wave of a hand, act as if my words weren't worth hearing. And my mother? She would watch it all in silence, her lips curling at the edges, something almost amused in her expression. Sometimes when Victor's teasing became especially cruel, when Elise's perfect, soft voice carried venom in the way only a sister's could, I would turn to Helena, hoping, just once, that she would stop them. That she would tell them to leave me alone. That she would remind them I was part of this family too. She never did. I remember one afternoon when I was 9. It was summer, the air thick and hot, the scent of lavender drifting in from the garden. I had spent hours sketching, a hobby I had taken up in secret, something that was mine alone. I had drawn the trees outside our house, the way the light cut through the leaves, the tiny wooden birdhouse Victor had built with our father before he left. I was proud of it. When I left the room for just a moment, Elise found the sketchbook. By the time I returned, she and Victor were laughing. My beautiful, careful drawing was ruined. Lines scribbled across the page, the ink smudged and smeared. What did you do? My voice cracked as I grabbed the book from their hands. Victor only shrugged. It was just a dumb drawing. Elise giggled. You're always so dramatic, Lena. Tears burned behind my eyes, my throat tightening. I turned to my mother, standing in the doorway. She had been watching the whole time. I searched her face for anger, for disappointment. Anything that would show she cared. But she only tilted her head slightly, lips pressing together in something that almost resembled a smile. You're too sensitive, she said. The words struck harder than Victor's laughter or Elisa's careless cruelty. They cut deeper because they told me there would be no justice, no fairness, not in this house. It happened again and again. My things taken without permission. My words ignored, dismissed, belittled. My presence treated as a nuisance. And every time I would look to Helena, hoping she would say something, hoping she would see me, she never did. Or worse, she would remind me why. "You'll never be like them," she told me one evening, her voice calm, matter of fact, as if it were an unchangeable truth. I was 12, sitting at the kitchen table. My hands curled into fists beneath the wooden surface. Victor and Elise had left for a party, one I wasn't invited to. Not that I had expected to be. Helena sat across from me, sipping her tea. I whispered, my voice small, embarrassed by how much I wanted her approval. She set her cup down with a soft clink. "That's the problem," she said simply. "They don't have to try. They just are." She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, and left me sitting alone at the table, my heart heavy with the truth I didn't want to accept. It didn't matter how much I wanted to belong. It didn't matter how hard I worked to be seen, to be loved. In her eyes I never would be. But I waited. And I worked. Every insult, every betrayal, every moment spent in the shadows fueled me. While they laughed, while they dismissed me, I gathered every sharp word, every act of cruelty, and stored them deep inside, letting them harden into something unbreakable. They thought I would stay small, that I would stay quiet. They were wrong. It started as a quiet rebellion. Small things at first. I stopped reacting. When Victor shoved past me in the hallway, I didn't flinch. When Elise borrowed my things without asking, I didn't complain. When my mother looked at me with that cold, assessing gaze, I met it without lowering my eyes. I learned to make my silence heavier than their words. I didn't just endure, I studied them. Victor, with his effortless charm, his careless confidence. People adored him, drawn in by his magnetic energy, but I saw the cracks. He needed the admiration, the validation. He was terrified of being ignored. The worst thing you could do to Victor was make him feel unimportant. Elise, so graceful, so perfectly composed until she wasn't. She lived for approval, for the knowledge that she was better, kinder, softer. But beneath it all was something fragile. She feared looking foolish, feared being exposed as something less than perfect. And my mother? Helena, with her cold, untouchable poise. She had spent years pretending I wasn't there, pretending I didn't matter. But I saw something in her too. A need for control. A need for things to be exactly as she wanted them. I would take that from her. But not yet. First, I had to become something they couldn't ignore. I worked harder than any of them. While Victor wasted his charm on fleeting friendships and empty praise, I studied. While Elise spent hours in front of the mirror, perfecting her image, I built something real. I knew that my way out wouldn't come from their world. I had to carve my own. I spent my nights buried in books, my days pushing myself past every limit. I learned everything I could: business, psychology, power. I watched how the world worked, how influence was gained and lost. I refused to be overlooked. I still remember the first time Victor realized I wasn't the weak little sister he thought I was. I was 18. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that no matter what he did, he would land on his feet because he always had. But that year, for the first time, he was failing a class, one he needed to graduate. He came to me, arrogant as ever, expecting me to help. "You're smart, Lena," he said, flashing that same easy smile that had gotten him out of trouble 1,000 times before. "Just write the paper for me. It's nothing for you." For years I would have done it. Just to have him say something kind, just to feel like I belonged. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I tilted my head, pretending to consider. "No." His smile faltered. "Come on. It's just one paper." I shrugged. "If it's just one paper, then you should be able to do it yourself." The frustration in his eyes was almost satisfying. He wasn't used to being denied. He wasn't used to me telling him no. But he wasn't the one I wanted to defeat. Helena was. She still treated me like I was nothing, even as I built myself into something unshakable. But I was patient. I waited for the moment when I could take everything from her. And that moment came. She had spent years molding Elise into her perfect heir, the one who would carry on the family's reputation, the one who would make the right connections, marry the right man, live the perfect life. But Elise was never as strong as Helena thought. She had spent her whole life terrified of making a mistake, and I knew exactly where to press. One carefully placed rumor. One whispered secret in the right ear. And everything Helena had built came crashing down. Elise's engagement, the one my mother had so carefully arranged, was ruined. The perfect daughter, the shining reflection of Helena's success, was suddenly a scandal. And Victor? He was already losing his grip, already falling from the pedestal she had placed him on. And then there was me. I was the one they had ignored, the one they had dismissed. And yet, when it mattered, I was the only one left standing. I had built my own life. My own power. And when I finally stood before Helena, when she finally had no choice but to see me, I smiled. "Looks like you were wrong," I said. She didn't answer. She couldn't. I built a life they could never dream of. While they stayed trapped in the small, crumbling world they had created, I broke free. I became something more, someone they had to notice. And when they finally turned to me, desperate, envious, suddenly so eager to claim me as one of their own, I smiled. Just like she used to. The first time Victor reached out to me, it was almost pathetic. I hadn't spoken to him in years. After I left, I made sure of that. I erased myself from their lives as cleanly as they had tried to erase me. And yet, there he was, standing in the lobby of my office, looking as lost as a child. He had aged, but not well. The years had softened his once effortless charm, dulled the arrogance that had once defined him. His confidence had been his greatest weapon, but now, stripped of it, he looked small. "Lena," he said, smiling like we were still children, like none of it had ever happened. I leaned back in my chair, studied him. "It's Elena." He hesitated, but covered it quickly. "Elena." "Of course." His eyes flickered around the office, modern, sleek, nothing like the world he knew. He cleared his throat. "It's been a long time." I said nothing. Let him fumble. His smile faltered. I wanted to see how you were doing." I let out a quiet laugh. He never cared how I was doing before. He winced, like he hadn't expected me to say it out loud. Maybe he thought I had forgotten. Maybe he hoped I had forgiven. I hadn't. "I heard about your company," he said after a pause. "You're doing well." I tilted my head. "And?" He shifted his weight. "And?" I was hoping we could talk. Now we were getting to it. I let the silence stretch between us. I wanted him to feel it, the weight of every moment he had ignored me, every time he had laughed at my pain, every time he had made it clear I wasn't worth his time. Finally, I gave him the smallest, coldest smile. "No." His face twisted in shock. "No. You don't get to walk into my life when it's convenient for you," I said, my voice calm, almost bored. "You don't get to pretend you ever saw me as anything other than a shadow." "Lena." "Elena," I corrected. For a second, something flashed in his eyes, frustration, anger, something that reminded me of the boy he used to be. But then just as quickly it faded. He nodded, slow and stiff. "I see." No, he didn't. He never would. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I didn't watch him go. He had already disappeared from my life years ago. Elise came next. She sent an email, first formal, polite, as if we were distant acquaintances. As if she hadn't spent our childhood making sure I knew I was beneath her. I ignored it. Then came the phone call. I let it go to voicemail. And then finally she showed up in person. Unlike Victor, she hadn't lost her shine. Elise had always known how to wear a mask, and she had perfected it over the years. She stood in the doorway of my office like she belonged there, dressed in quiet luxury, her hair swept into an effortless chignon. But I saw it. The tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers curled against her designer handbag. She needed something. "Elena," she greeted, voice smooth, careful. "Elise." She exhaled, stepping inside. "You look different." "I am." A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. "I was hoping we could talk." I gestured for her to sit. Not because I wanted to make this easier for her, but because I wanted to watch her squirm. She sat with perfect posture. Legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I know we weren't close growing up," she began. I raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to put it." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I made mistakes. We all did." I let out a soft hum, unimpressed. Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her dress. "I need your help, Elena." And there it was. I leaned back, feigning curiosity. "With what?" She hesitated just for a second, but I caught it. "My husband," she admitted. "He's leaving me." Of course. Elise had built her entire life around being the perfect wife, the perfect woman. And now that perfect world was crumbling. "I see," I said, voice neutral. She swallowed. I don't know what to do." A younger version of me would have felt pity, would have wanted to help. But that girl was dead. Elise, I said, my voice soft, almost kind. You'll figure it out. Her lips parted, eyes widening slightly. Just like I had to. For a moment she just stared at me. And then slowly she nodded. She understood. She stood without another word and left. And I didn't stop her. Helena was the last. I expected her to hold out longer. She was proud. She never admitted weakness. But in the end even she came. She didn't look different. She was still composed, still elegant, still cold. But I knew my mother too well. I saw the way her shoulders were just a little too stiff. The way her fingers curled just slightly as she stood before me. She had spent her whole life making sure I knew I was nothing to her. And now she needed me. Elena, she said, voice steady. I didn't stand. Didn't invite her to sit. Mother. Her lips pressed together at that. She had never liked the word. Too human. Too sentimental. I hear you've done well for yourself, she said. I tilted my head. I have. A pause. Then finally she exhaled. I was wrong about you. Something sharp twisted in my chest. The words I had once craved more than anything. But they meant nothing now. I smiled, slow and deliberate. I know. She studied me, searching for something. Maybe the girl she had tried so hard to erase. But she was gone. I had built something greater. And I had done it without them. For a moment she didn't move. Helena had always been a woman of control, of precise words and measured silences. But this was unfamiliar ground. I watched as her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the only betrayal of emotion she allowed herself. The lines around her mouth deepened, her lips pressing together in a thin, unreadable line. She had spent a lifetime teaching me how to hold back, how to suffocate my own feelings until they were nothing but ghosts in my chest. And yet, here she stood, caught in the same trap she had once set for me. Elena, she said, her voice calm, but I could hear it, that fine, almost imperceptible tremor beneath her carefully polished exterior. I came to make things right. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. Right. She nodded once. I misjudged you. I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. No, you didn't. Her expression barely shifted, but I saw the way her eyes flickered. Just for a second, like she had hoped I would take the lie and let it soothe old wounds. But I wasn't a child anymore. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her to rewrite history. She wasn't here for me. She was here for herself. I made mistakes, she admitted carefully, like the words themselves were foreign to her. But I want to fix them. Fix them. I repeated. I let the silence stretch long and heavy before I added. Or undo them? She inhaled, sharp and shallow. I had never seen her falter before. And yet, here she was standing before me exposed. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. Because I knew the truth. Helena didn't come for redemption. She came because she had nowhere else to go. Her world, her carefully constructed kingdom of control, of perfection, of power was falling apart. And I had built something greater. The rumors had reached me before she ever did. The family was unraveling. Victor had gambled away his savings and Elise's divorce had bled her dry. Helena's empire, her spotless reputation, her place among the people she had spent a lifetime manipulating, was crumbling. She had always been untouchable. Until she wasn't. Until the world she ruled turned on her. I had spent years waiting for them to notice me, to want me, to claim me as one of their own. And now here they were crawling back. I leaned back in my chair, studying her the way I had once studied her as a child, searching for answers in the face of a woman who had never offered them freely. What do you want, mother? Her lips pressed tighter. She had always hated that question. I thought we could talk, she said. About the past. About the future. I smiled. Slow. Cold. I don't think we have a future. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. And then, for the first time in my life, I saw it. Fear. Helena never showed fear. She had always been the immovable force, the unshakable presence, the woman who stood above it all. But now she stood before me, smaller than I had ever seen her. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, all I felt was a quiet, distant sort of pity. Not for her. For the girl I used to be. The one who had once thought she needed this woman's love. Helena inhaled, slow and careful. I know I was difficult. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That's an interesting word for it. She didn't react. Not outwardly. But I saw it. The way her shoulders tensed just slightly. The way her eyes flickered down before she forced them back up. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to being powerless. I did what I thought was best, she said. I raised an eyebrow. For who? She didn't answer. Because we both knew. She had never done anything for me. I had clawed my way out of the shadows alone. I had built my life without her. And I wasn't going to let her rewrite history to make herself feel better about it. Silence settled between us, thick and heavy. And then finally she exhaled. I should go, she said. I said nothing. She hesitated just for a moment. And then she turned, walking toward the door with that same slow, deliberate grace she had always carried. For a moment, I thought she would leave without another word. But then at the last second she paused, glancing back at me. Elena, she said, voice quiet. I am proud of you. The words should have meant something. Once they would have been everything. But now they were nothing more than a whisper in the wind. I met her gaze unflinching. You're too late. She held my eyes for one last moment. And then she was gone. I sat there for a long time after she left. And I realized something. I didn't need closure. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need anything from her at all. Because I had already won. I had built a life they could never touch. And I had done it without them.